How Medieval Peasants Survived the Coldest Nights of the Year showcases clever solutions to the extreme cold. And have you ever wondered why medieval peasants didn't freeze to death on those nights? Cold nights, chilling winters. Well, they were actually pretty clever about it, and no, they didn't have heated blankets or space heaters hidden away in their cottages. In fact, their solutions to staying warm were way more creative than you might think. Underground living and house design. Let's talk about their houses first. Now, I used to think medieval peasants just threw together some wooden shacks and called it a day, boy. Was I wrong? These folks were basically the original underground living enthusiasts. They dug their houses about 2 to 3 feet into the ground, which might not sound like much, but it's basically like building your house in a shallow swimming pool. Except instead of keeping cool, they were trying to stay warm, and it worked. Recent archaeological studies showed these partially sunken houses stayed about 10 degrees warmer than surface dwellings during winter months. You know how your parents always yell at you for leaving the front door open because they're not trying to heat the whole neighborhood. Medieval peasants took that energy-saving mindset to the extreme. Their windows were tiny. We're talking barely bigger than your head, tiny. And those low ceilings weren't just because medieval people were shorter, though they were. It was all about keeping the heat where they wanted it inside wattle and daub. Surprisingly effective insulation. Medieval peasants used something called wattle and daub to insulate their homes. Now, before you get excited, wattle isn't some cute medieval animal. It's basically a bunch of twigs woven together like a massive basket. And do well. It's a delightful mixture of clay straw and, wait for it, manure. Yes, they literally put poop in their walls the next time your room smells a bit funky. Just remember, at least your walls aren't made of medieval composting material. Though I have to say, these walls were surprisingly effective. Archaeological experiments have shown they provided insulation comparable to a modern wall with basic fiberglass insulation. The central hearth, the heart of the home, the winner of medieval heating, was the central hearth. This wasn't just any old fireplace. It was the medieval equivalent of a combination microwave heater and social media hub all rolled into one, located right in the middle of the house. It did everything from cooking their meals to keeping them warm. And it was where all the hot gossip about whose ox ran away with whose cow was shared. Recent archaeological digs have uncovered some fascinating stats about these hearths. In a typical peasant house, from around 1300, the central hearth could maintain temperatures between 50 to 60 degrees, even when it was freezing outside. That might sound chilly to us modern folks who cry when the thermostat drops below 72. But for medieval peasants, it was practically tropical strategic house design and seasonal adaptations. They were geniuses on how they designed their single-room homes. Everything was strategic, from the placement of sleeping areas as far from drafts as possible to the angle of the roof steep enough to shed snow, but not so steep that the thatch would slide off. It was like a medieval version of Fun-You, except instead of arranging furniture for good luck, they were arranging it so they wouldn't wake up as human popsicles. Archaeological evidence shows they even oriented their houses to face the sun's path, maximizing natural heat during winter days, and something that would make modern architects scratch their heads. These houses were actually designed to be a bit smoky. Inside, the smoke from the hearth would rise and help create an insulating layer near the ceiling, while also protecting the thatch roof from insects and rot. Studies of preserved medieval roofs show that this smoky environment actually doubled the lifespan of thatched roofs. Some clever archaeologists recently found evidence that peasants would actually modify their homes seasonally in autumn. They'd patch up any holes in the walls with fresh daub and add extra layers of thatch to the roof. They'd even hang blankets or animal skins on the walls for added insulation. medieval tapestries for the common folk, if you will. And unlike our modern homes, where every room has a different temperature, these single-room houses were surprisingly efficient at maintaining consistent warmth. Centuries of trial and error, evolving housing techniques. But perhaps the most impressive thing about medieval housing wasn't just the architecture. It was how these techniques evolved over centuries of trial and error. Each generation added their own little improvements, like a really slow game of architectural telephone that lasted hundreds of years. Archaeological evidence shows that houses from the early medieval period, around 800 AD, were much simpler. But by the 1300s, they had developed into these surprisingly sophisticated warmthing machines. Some of their heating solutions were actually better than what we use today. Those thick, breathable walls of wattle and daub, fantastic at regulating humidity and preventing mold, something our modern drywall isn't always great at, and their steep thatched roofs perfect for handling heavy snow loads, way better than some modern flat roof buildings that collapse after a big snowstorm. But living in a medieval house wasn't all cozy. Fires and clever design. The smoke from the hearth would make your eyes water. The roof needed constant repairs, and there was always the chance that a stray spark could set the whole place ablaze. But hey, at least you didn't have to worry about paying the heating bill or programming a smart thermostat. The incredibly precise daily schedule. Speaking of daily life in these houses, you wouldn't believe the incredibly precise schedule medieval families followed to make the most of their homes. Features. Their daily routine was like a perfectly choreographed dance timed exactly with the sun's movement and the day's temperature changes. You'd think medieval peasants just woke up whenever they felt like it and went about their day randomly, right-wrong. Their schedule was so precise, it makes my attempts at time management look like a toddler trying to organize a birthday party. The golden hours were between 10:00 a.m. and 2:00 p. And what medieval folks called high sun. This wasn't because they were late risers who enjoyed sleeping in, no. This 4-hour window was when temperatures peaked and everyone in the village coordinated their most important work. During this time, manor court records from 1267 show that villages actually find people who didn't stick to these communal work hours in winter. Talk about strict scheduling, and you thought your school's tardy policy was harsh. One village in northern England even had a system where repeat offenders had to donate extra firewood to the community stockpile. Now, recent studies of medieval manor records show that villages developed what historians call frost watches. Different families would take turns keeping the communal fires going throughout the night. Each family had their assigned nights marked in the manor rolls right next to their tax obligations. Miss your turn at Frost Watch, that'll be 1 chicken or 3 dozen eggs as a penalty. Medieval peasants didn't mess around. With their heating duties, archaeological evidence suggests some villages even had special warning systems, usually a series of horn blasts to alert frost watchers when temperatures dropped dangerously low. The first sleep and second sleep routine, the morning routine, started way before sunrise. But not with what you'd expect. Instead of jumping right into work, medieval folks had what they called first sleep and second sleep. They'd wake up around midnight for an hour or two, do some light tasks, socialize a bit, then go back to bed until the dawn. Medical records from the 1300s show doctors actually recommended this split sleep pattern for better health. Meanwhile, we modern folks feel guilty about taking a 20-minute power nap at our desks. Historical documents show this midnight wake period was considered so normal. Communal meal times and bread ovens, meal times, were a whole other level of coordination. The entire village would eat their main meal together around 11:1 and when the communal bread ovens were at their hottest. Archaeological evidence from village sites shows these ovens were massive. Some could bake up to 100 loaves at once. One baker's log from 1290 A recorded that a village of 80 people could heat their homes by about 3 degrees Tixon. Just from the bread ovens alone, talk about killing two birds with one stone, or should I say feeding two needs with one heat. The timing was so crucial that villages actually had bread bells that would ring when the ovens reached optimal temperature afternoon indoor work. In twilight councils, the afternoon had its own clever timing tricks between two peas. And sunset work moved indoors. This wasn't because medieval peasants were lazy. It was a pure survival strategy. Court records show villages actually had official cold watchers who would monitor temperatures using primitive but effective methods, like watching how quickly water froze in clay pots. When these watchers gave the signal, everyone knew it was time to head inside, where the day's stored heat could be put to good use. Some villages even developed a point system. You'd lose points for being caught working outside after the cold warning, and too many lost points meant extra community service duties. You know those people who always complain about meetings that could have been emails? Medieval peasants would laugh at our inefficiency. They had something called twilight councils. Community meetings held in the largest house in the village, right as the sun was setting. This wasn't just about saving daylight. The body heat from dozens of people gathered together could raise the temperature of a large room by up to 5 degrees. Now, that's what I call a productive meeting. Historical records show these meetings were so effective at heating that some villages actually scheduled their most important discussions for the coldest days, coordinated bedtimes, and fire-eating duties. They even coordinated their bedtimes, not because they had strict parents, but because the last family to bank their fire for the night was responsible for checking all the other houses. Fires were safely banked. 2 manor records show this job rotated weekly, and getting caught sleeping on the job literally meant you had to donate a portion of your fuel supply to the community stockpile. One particular record from 1289 mentions a man who fell asleep during his fire-checking duties and had to give up half his winter firewood as punishment. Sophisticated food preservation techniques. These medieval communities had some pretty incredible methods for preserving their food. Through the winter months, their storage techniques were just as sophisticated as their timing strategies. And some of them might surprise you. Medieval peasants would have crushed it on those survival TV shows. Their food preservation techniques were so smart that modern scientists are actually studying them. Just don't tell Gordon Ramsay about some of their methods. He might have a meltdown, though. Honestly, their preservation skills might even impress him. Once he got past all the dirt. Let's start underground. Medieval peasants had these brilliant storage pits that kept temperatures steady at around 40 waters. Year-round, recent archaeological digs found thousands of these pits across England. They were basically the medieval equivalent of your refrigerator's crisper drawer. Except they actually worked. One village in Yorkshire had over 200 storage pits for just 50 families. That's 4 personal underground fridges per household. And here we are, fighting over fridge space with our roommates. Archaeological analysis shows these pits were so well designed that they maintain more stable temperatures than some modern root cellars. Vegetable thermometers and layered hay insulation. They turn their vegetables into natural thermometers. Root vegetables like carrots and turnips were placed in specific spots within these pits. If the carrots started showing signs of frost damage, they knew they needed to add more insulation. If they started sprouting, they needed better ventilation. A medieval manuscript from 1283 actually lists different vegetables in order of their cold sensitivity. It's like a primitive temperature monitoring system. But with turnips, instead of technology, recent studies of these manuscripts reveal they had identified over 20 different vegetable varieties with varying cold tolerances. Now about that hay. Everyone keeps talking about medieval peasants. Didn't just use it for their animals. They wrapped their houses in it like a giant winter coat. But the genius move is that they stored this insulating hay in layers around their food. Storage areas, archaeological evidence from a 13th century village, shows they created what scientists now call thermal gradient zones. Each layer of hay reduced the temperature fluctuation. By about 2 to 3 layers of hay meant your food storage stayed 6 degrees more stable. Not bad for people who never took a physics class. Modern experiments recreating these methods have shown they're nearly as effective as some modern insulation materials, the snow trick, and underground storage systems. The snow trick is where things get really interesting. They'd pack snow against their food storage areas in carefully calculated layers. Studies of preserved medieval storage structures show they could maintain temperatures of 35 to 38 degrees for weeks after the snow melted by using this method. One particularly well-preserved site in northern England showed evidence of snow pits that could keep food cold until May. That's some serious medieval air conditioning. The layout of these snow pits suggests they understood principles of thermal mass centuries before the concept was formally defined. But the winner of medieval food preservation were the underground storage systems from the 1200s. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were engineering masterpieces. Archaeologists found storage pits with multiple chambers, each one designed for different types of food. They had drainage systems that would make a modern plumber impressed, airflow channels that work like natural ventilation, and even primitive humidity control using clay pots filled with water. Analysis of soil samples from these pits shows they maintain humidity levels between 85 to 95% perfect for long-term vegetable storage. Some of these storage systems were so effective that when archaeologists excavated them in the 1960s, they found preserved seeds that were still viable after 700 years. The scientists actually managed to grow medieval turnips from these seeds. I bet those were the most historically significant turnips ever served in a tea. University cafeteria DNA analysis of these ancient seeds has helped scientists understand how medieval crops differed from modern varieties, food rotation systems, and the fool's test. The preservation methods weren't just about keeping food cold. Though medieval peasants had this whole system of rotating their stored foods based on temperature changes. They'd move roots and vegetables between different storage zones like they were playing some complicated game of chess manner. Records from 1292 show detailed instructions for this rotation system. It's basically a medieval version of those cooking shows where they have to quick-fire, reorganize a pantry. Except failing means you might not eat in February. The records even include penalty systems for families who didn't follow the rotation schedule. But my favorite discovery has to be the fool's test. According to Manor Court records, villages would assign someone to taste a tiny bit of stored food every few days if they got sick. Well, let's just say it wasn't the most popular job in the village. They even had a rotation system for this duty, kind of like jury duty. But with more potential stomach aches, one record shows a man tried to get out of this duty by claiming he had already died from bad turnips. Medieval humor, folks. Historical documents suggest this testing system actually saved many villages from foodborne illnesses. During harsh winters, these preservation techniques weren't just random lucky guesses. Manor records show they kept detailed notes about what worked and what didn't. Passing this knowledge down through generations, we found preservation. Guides from the 1200s that read like scientific journals, complete with observations about temperature, timing, and storage conditions. They might not have had thermometers, but they sure knew their stuff about keeping food fresh. Medieval cooking skills and calorie counting, all this careful food preservation meant they needed some serious cooking skills to turn their stored ingredients into actual meals. And let me tell you what they did with these preserved foods. In their medieval kitchens, would put some modern cooking shows to shame. The science behind medieval food was absolutely genius. These people were professional calorie counters before it was cool, except instead of trying to lose weight, they were trying not to freeze to death. And they were surprisingly good at it. Medieval doctors actually prescribed specific foods for winter survival records from the 1300s. Show they recommended eating between 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily during the coldest months. That's more than what Olympic swimmers eat today, but here's the catch: they had to get those calories from food that could last through winter without spoiling my local supermarket. Can barely keep bananas fresh for a week. But these folks had winter food stores down to a science. Medical texts from the period show they understood the connection between caloric intake and body temperature with remarkable accuracy. Pottage, the medieval super stew. The star of medieval winter cuisine was pottage, a thick stew that stayed simmering in the pot for days, sometimes weeks. Every time someone got hungry, they just throw more ingredients. Archaeological analysis of medieval cooking. Punts shows traces of meals that kept going for up to 3 weeks. Modern food safety inspectors would have a heart attack. But medieval peasants had figured out that the constant simmering actually killed harmful bacteria. Recent studies of these cooking methods show they were surprisingly effective at maintaining food safety. The magic happens when they know how they layered flavors and nutrients. Manna records from 1286 show a village near York had specific rules about pottage ingredients. The bottom layer had to be root vegetables for steady energy, the middle layer needed beans or peas for protein, and the top layer was whatever grains they had left for quick energy. It was basically a medieval food pyramid in a pot. Scientists studying these recipes found they provided a perfect balance of complex and simple carbohydrates for sustained energy. Throughout the cold days, analysis of preserved pottage residues shows they were getting more balanced nutrition than many modern people. Fermented foods and winter beer, but the true medieval superfood fermented everything. They fermented grains into beer fruits, into wine, and vegetables into preserves that would make modern probiotics look amateur. One particularly detailed manner. Record from 1292 describes a special winter beer that was nearly as thick as honey and packed with calories. Modern recreations of this recipe showed it contained about 400 calories per pint. That's like drinking a cheeseburger. Laboratory analysis of recreated medieval fermented foods shows they contained up to 10 times more probiotic strains than modern fermented foods. Medieval peasants might have had healthier gut bacteria than we do. Recent studies of preserved human remains from medieval villages show evidence of incredibly diverse gut microbiomes. All that fermented food and whole grain bread actually gave them better digestive health than many of us have today. Take that. Modern kombucha fans, scientists have identified over 50 different beneficial bacterial strains in medieval gut samples that are rare or absent in modern populations. Medieval bread, dense, dark, and nutritious. The bread they ate wasn't anything like our fluffy white bread either. Medieval winter bread was dense, dark, and usually slightly fermented. Archaeological evidence shows their grain mills were terrible at removing bran and germ from wheat, which accidentally made their bread way more nutritious than modern white bread. One loaf of medieval bread contained more fiber than a modern person eats in 3 days. Sure, it was probably hard enough to use as a weapon, but it kept them alive through winter. Chemical analysis of preserved bread samples shows they were getting up to 40% more nutrients from their bread than we get from modern whole grain bread. Specialized winter versions of common foods. They even had specialized winter versions of common foods. Scientists studying medieval recipes found They would deliberately overcook some grains to make them more digestible and calorie-dense. A porridge recipe from 1278 specifies cooking the grains until they're soft as a child's teeth. Gross description, but brilliant science. The longer cooking time broke down the complex starches, making the calories more readily available for keeping warm. Modern nutritional analysis shows this cooking method increased the bioavailability of calories by up to 30%. Seasonal diet changes in meal timing. The medieval diet changed dramatically with the season's records. From various manor cords show they ate nearly twice as much fat and protein in winter as they did in summer. They also timed their meals based on digestion. Science, manor records, show specific winter eating schedules. The biggest meal at dawn when they needed energy to warm up another large meal at midday to keep the heat going, and a smaller meal before bed to fuel overnight warmth. They understood food generated body heat better than some modern nutritionists. Studies of medieval meal timing show it was nearly perfectly aligned with our modern understanding of chronobiology and metabolic efficiency. Shared sleeping arrangements. The science of spooning with all this focus on high-calorie foods and staying warm. You might wonder how medieval peasants managed to get any rest in their crowded houses while they're sleeping. Arrangements were just as scientifically thought out as their diet. Modern parents freak out when kids crawl into their bed, but medieval families took shared sleeping to a whole new level. Archaeological evidence from the 1250s shows entire families. We're talking up to 6 people sharing what was basically a wooden platform with some straw on it. And you thought your twin-sized college dorm bed was cramped. Recent analysis of medieval household records suggests these tight sleeping quarters might have actually helped. Medieval families survived temperatures that would have killed people sleeping separately. In fact, studies show the combined body heat in these shared beds could raise the local temperature by up to 8 during they didn't sleep flat on their backs. Like we do today, archaeological research of medieval bed platforms shows they slept semi-reclined, almost like they were in a comfy chair. Scientists studying this position found it was actually brilliant for heat conservation. It reduced the surface area exposed to cold air by about 30% compared to lying flat. Plus, it made it easier to pack more people into the sleeping space. Medieval problems required medieval solutions. Studies of preserved bed platforms show wear patterns consistent with the semi-reclined position, suggesting it was the standard sleeping posture for centuries. Modern sleep researchers have even found this position might have helped prevent some respiratory problems common in cold weather. Sleep inspectors and fines for inefficient sleeping. Recent studies of manor court records revealed something fascinating about these sleeping arrangements. Villages actually had official sleep inspectors who would check that families were using their bed space efficiently during the coldest months. One record from 1289 shows a family getting fined for spreading out too much in their bed. Platform apparently gaps between sleepers were considered a waste of precious warmth. Talk about strict bedroom rules, the fines could be pretty steep, too. One family had to give up a whole week's worth of firewood as punishment for inefficient sleeping arrangements. These sleep inspectors even carried measuring rods to ensure proper spacing between sleepers. The engineering marvels of medieval platforms. The bed platforms themselves were engineering marvels disguised as simple furniture. Archaeologists studying preserved medieval beds found they were built with multiple layers of insulation. The bottom layer was usually packed. Straw changed seasonally, followed by a layer of wool when they could afford it, and topped with whatever fabrics the family owned. But what's clever is that they angled these platforms at precisely 15 degrees modern. Thermal analysis shows this angle created perfect air circulation while minimizing heat loss. These people were basically sleep scientists. Recent reconstructions of these beds have shown they maintain temperatures up to 12 warmer than flat sleeping surfaces. The layered construction also help prevent drafts, with each layer reducing air movement by approximately 40% spooning and rotating sleep positions. Getting the bedding arrangement wrong could be a serious problem. Manor records from 1250 to 1350 show multiple cases of families being relocated to the communal hall during extreme cold snaps because they failed to maintain proper sleeping conditions. One particularly dramatic account from 198 describes a village elder demonstrating proper sleep positioning by arranging the entire family like spoons in a drawer. Medieval people invented spooning, who knew historical records. Suggest this spooning arrangement could raise body temperature by up to 2 degrees or nausea compared to random positioning. Scientific analysis of shared body heat distribution shows this arrangement was nearly perfect for heat retention. The height of the bed platform mattered too. Archaeological evidence shows they built these platforms exactly 18 and off the ground. Some particularly clever households even built their bed platforms directly above the cattle pen. Medieval underfloor heating at its finest temperature measurements in reconstructed medieval houses show this elevation could mean a difference of up to 5 degrees. Soon, the platforms were also slightly tilted toward the center, creating a subtle bowl effect that kept everyone from rolling out while sleeping. It's also impressive how they scheduled sleep, unlike today where everyone just crashes. Whenever they feel like it, medieval families coordinated their sleep positions throughout the night. The youngest and oldest family members who needed the most warmth started in the middle of the group as people got up for their various night duties, checking the fires, tending to animals, or the infamous first sleep activities. They would rotate positions to maintain optimal heat distribution. It was like a complex dance choreography, except everyone was unconscious. Manor records actually include detailed diagrams showing these rotation patterns and schedules. Medieval winter fashion, unwashed wool, and layering. Those warm bodies needed proper clothing to make the most of their shared sleeping space. And medieval people had some pretty sophisticated fashion solutions. Forget everything you've seen in medieval movies. These people weren't running around in thin tunics during winter. The real medieval fashion scene would shock modern designers. For starters, they never washed their winter clothes. Before you say gross, there was actual science behind this decision. The natural lanolin in wool acts as a waterproofing agent, and washing removes it. One medieval text from 1267 specifically warns, "A clean wool cloak is a cold wool cloak." Medieval people understood chemistry without knowing what chemistry was. Modern lab tests on preserved medieval garments show unwashed wool clothing retained up to 40% more water resistance than washed versions. Wool was the superstar of medieval winter wear. Archaeological evidence shows they didn't just wear one layer of wool, they wore up to 5 layers. Each layer was processed differently to serve a specific purpose. The innermost layer was soft and thin, while outer layers were progressively thicker and coarser. Scientists studying preserved medieval clothing found this layering technique created air pockets that trapped heat more effectively than modern polyester tests. Show a typical medieval winter outfit could maintain body heat for up to 6 hours in freezing temperatures. Analysis of the weaving patterns reveals they even adjusted the direction of the wool fibers in each layer to maximize insulation, moss, and straw insulation, and fat-based waterproofing. But it gets interesting when they stuff their clothes with dried moss and straw. Recent analysis of preserved clothing from the 1300s shows traces of over 12 different types of moss used for insulation. Each type had different properties. Some were naturally antimicrobial, others were better at trapping air manner records. Even show villages had designated moss collectors who knew exactly which types to gather one record from. 1292 describes a heated argument between two villages over access to a particularly good moss gathering spot. Medieval people literally fought over moss. That's how important it was. Scientific analysis of these moss varieties shows some had insulation, properties comparable to modern synthetic materials. The really impressive thing is in how they treated their winter clothes. They'd rub them with animal fat, usually sheep or deer, to increase water resistance. Lab tests on recreated medieval clothing shows this treatment was surprisingly effective. It could repel water for up to 4 hours in heavy rain. They also discovered that mixing certain types of tree sap with the fat made it even more water resistant. A medieval recipe from 1285 specifies mixing pine sap with sheep fat in exact proportions that modern scientists say is nearly identical to modern waterproofing formulas. Recent experiments show this mixture could maintain its water-resistant properties for up to 3 months. Before needing reapplication, linen undergarments were the medieval equivalent of high-tech base layers, but only wealthy peasants could afford them. Instead, most people use this trick of weaving their innermost wool layer with nettle fibers. Modern textile analysis shows this created a fabric that wickeded moisture away from the body almost as effectively as modern synthetic materials. It was itchy as anything, but it kept you dry and warm. One medieval writer complained about the eternal itch of winter clothes, but noted it was better than freezing laboratory tests. Indicate these nettle wool blends could wick moisture at 80% the efficiency of modern performance fabrics. Purposeful hood and shoe design. Every piece of medieval winter clothing had a specific purpose. Take their weird-looking hoods, for example. Archaeological finds show they weren't just floppy caps. They were engineered with multiple panels that could be adjusted based on wind direction tests. On reconstructed medieval hoods, showed they could reduce wind chill effects by up to 60% when properly positioned. And those funnel-looking pointy shoes, they were actually designed to minimize contact with frozen ground. Less surface area meant less heat loss through the feet. Modern thermal imaging shows these designs reduced heat loss by up to 25% compared to conventional medieval footwear, clothing. Maintenance and seasonal rotation. Medieval clothing maintenance was an art form. They stored winter clothes in special chests with aromatic herbs that naturally repelled moss. But these weren't just any herbs. They chose specific combinations that also had antimicrobial properties. Scientists testing preserved medieval clothing chests found traces of herbs that are now known to contain natural antibacterial compounds. These people were fighting bacteria before they knew bacteria existed. Chemical analysis of these herb combinations shows they were as effective as some modern mothball alternatives. They also had seasonal clothing rotation down to a science manner. Records show specific dates for changing over to winter clothes based on generations of weather observations. But it wasn't just about the calendar. They watched for specific signs in nature. One record from 1278 lists things like when the blackberries wither and when the geese fly south as signals to break out the heavy winter gear. Modern meteorologists have found these natural indicators were surprisingly accurate, predictors of temperature changes often matching modern forecasting. With 85% accuracy, community clothing projects in shared warmth. Their winter clothes were community projects. Villages would hold spinning bees where everyone gathered to process wool and make winter clothing together. But this wasn't just about socializing body heat. From 20 to 30 people working in one space could raise the temperature enough to keep everyone warm, While they worked, one manor record shows a village saving 3 weeks' worth of firewood by organizing group sewing sessions in cold weather, temperature measurements in reconstructed medieval workshops. Show these gatherings could raise room temperature by up to 60 ewanks animals indoors. The medieval underfloor heating system. When those warm woolen clothes weren't quite enough to fight off the bitter cold, medieval peasants had another trick up their sleeves. They brought their animals inside, and these weren't just any old farm animals. A single cow could raise the room temperature by 2 to 3 degrees. And that might not sound like much until you realize most medieval families kept 3 or 4 cows inside. During winter, add in some sheep, chickens, and maybe a pig or two, and suddenly you've got a pretty cozy setup. Researchers studying medieval housing layouts found that strategic animal placement could create temperature increases of up to 10. Modern thermal imaging of recreated medieval homes shows these temperature gains could last for up to 12 hours at a time. The most efficient arrangements could maintain these temperatures with just half the usual firewood consumption. The science behind this was actually pretty advanced. Archaeological evidence shows medieval houses had specific zones for different animals based on how much body heat they generated. Cows, being the premium heaters, got prime spots near sleeping areas. Pigs, which generate about half as much heat as cows, were placed near food storage areas. Chickens, despite their tiny size, were particularly valued because they could fit into small spaces and still pump out surprising amounts of warmth. One medieval record from 1288 actually ranks animals by their heating value. A cow was worth 4 sheep, or 16 chickens in terms of warmth. Recent scientific analysis confirms these medieval heat calculations were remarkably accurate, with modern thermodynamic studies showing only a 5% variance from their estimations, the primitive greenhouse effect in humidity control. But it wasn't just about the heat these animals created, what scientists now call a primitive greenhouse effect. Their breath and body heat would create warm, humid air that helped prevent the bitter cold from seeping in. Modern environmental scientists have recreated these conditions and found that animal-warmed medieval houses could maintain relative humidity around 60%, perfect for preventing both freezing and mold growth. Your modern humidifier has nothing on medieval livestock. Lab tests show this humidity level also helped preserve wooden structures and prevented respiratory problems common in dry winter air. The combination of heat and humidity created a microclimate that could extend food preservation times by up to 3 weeks. Specialized winter quarters for animals. It is really clever how they designed special winter quarters for the animals. Archaeological digs have uncovered evidence of raised platforms in specialized feeding troughs that kept animals in specific positions to maximize heat distribution. One particularly well-preserved site showed a system where cows were positioned so their breath would create a warm air current flowing toward the family sleeping area. These people were medieval HVAC engineers. Analysis of airflow patterns in reconstructed buildings shows these arrangements could increase effective temperature by an additional 2 to 3 degrees. Studies of preserved floor plans reveal they even accounted for seasonal wind direction when positioning their animal pens. Manor court records and animal heat disputes. Manor court records reveal some pretty interesting disputes about winter animal arrangements. One document from 1276 describes 2 families arguing over whose turn it was to host the village's largest bull. Apparently, he was the premium heating unit in town. Another record shows a family being fined for trying to claim their skinny cow provided as much heat as their neighbors. Fat one, they actually had standards for. This stuff. Court records include detailed testimonies from animal heat assessors who would evaluate livestock for their warming potential. These assessors developed a sophisticated scoring system based on animal size, age, and health that modern researchers find remarkably consistent with actual heat output measurements, convection currents, and waste management. The arrangement wasn't just random either. Scientists studying medieval floor plans found they positioned animals to create convection currents that would circulate warm air throughout the house. The animal's body heat would cause the air to rise, creating a natural circulation system. Tests in reconstructed medieval houses show this system could maintain temperatures above freezing even when it was 10 degrees outside. No wonder these arrangements were taken so seriously. They were literally life-saving. Modern airflow studies have revealed these medieval designs achieve 70% of the efficiency of modern passive heating systems. Some particularly well-designed houses could maintain stable temperatures for up to 18 hours without additional fuel. But keeping animals inside came with its own challenges. Medieval people developed sophisticated waste management systems that would impress modern farmers. They used layers of straw and ash to create composting floors that absorbed animal waste, while generating additional heat through decomposition. Recent analysis of preserved medieval floor layers shows the system could add another 1 to 2 degrees of warmth to the house. Talk about making the best of a smelly situation. Chemical analysis of these floor layers reveals they also produced natural antiseptic compounds that help prevent disease. The layered composting system created a self-sustaining cycle that provided both heat and fertilizer for spring planting, feeding systems, and animal to human heat ratios. The animals also needed to be fed and watered without letting all the warm air escape. Archaeological evidence shows they developed clever feeding systems using chutes and hatches that minimized how often doors needed to be opened. One particularly innovative design from a 1290s house shows a rotating feed box that could be loaded from outside and turned inward. Medieval people invented the pet door testing of reconstructed feeding systems. Shows they reduced warm air loss during feeding by up to 50%. They also understood the delicate balance between animal heat and human comfort. Manor records show they carefully calculated how many animals could be kept indoors without making the house too smelly or unhealthy. For humans, they knew too much of a good thing. Could be bad. Scientists have even analyzed medieval manure composition and found they strategically adjusted animal diets to minimize ammonia production and maintain breathable air quality.